The sun hung low over the red clay roads of Forsyth, Georgia, in the spring of 1877, casting long shadows that stretched like weary fingers across the dusty streets. The air was thick with the scent of blooming dogwoods and the faint, lingering bitterness of defeat that still clung to the South 12 years after Appomattox. Reconstruction had come and gone like a fleeting storm, leaving behind a landscape scarred by resentment and unfinished promises. Federal troops had pulled out, the Compromise of 1877 sealing their departure, and now the Redeemers held sway, their vision of restored white supremacy echoing in every courthouse, cotton field, and church pew. In this small town, where the Chattahoochee River wound lazily through the landscape, carrying away the mud of spring rains, and where old Confederate flags were tucked away in attics but never truly forgotten, lived Isaiah Freeman, a man whose life was a testament to the fragile line between heroism and oblivion. Isaiah was 64 years old, his frame lean and weathered from years of toil and trial, bent but not broken by the weight of his experiences. His skin, dark as the fertile earth he once tilled as a slave on the Whitaker plantation 20 miles upstream, bore the marks of a life unyielding. Scars from whips on his back that formed a crisscross pattern like the branches of a thorn tree, a limp from a mini ball embedded in his hip during the Battle of Olustee in Florida, where the pain flared on damp days like this one, and eyes that held the quiet depth of someone who had seen too much death to fear it anymore, eyes that had witnessed comrades fall in bloody heaps and enemies charge with bayonets fixed. He wore a faded blue Union forage cap, its brass insignia dulled by time and the sweat of countless marches, and a threadbare coat that concealed a ribbon he rarely spoke of, the Medal of Honor citation he had earned but never officially received, lost in the bureaucratic maze of Washington's war offices amid the chaos of demobilization. For a decade, since mustering out of the 107th United States Colored Troops in 1865, Isaiah had made his home in a modest shack on the outskirts of Forsyth, a one-room structure of rough-hewn pine logs chinked with mud, with a tin roof that rattled in the wind and leaked during summer storms, forcing him to place buckets strategically on the dirt floor. He survived on a meager pension that Congress doled out sporadically to black veterans, payments that arrived months late or not at all, leaving him to scrounge for food and rely on the kindness of fellow freedmen who shared what little they had. He worked odd jobs when his body allowed, shoeing horses at the livery stable where the owner eyed him suspiciously and docked his pay for imaginary mistakes, or teaching the children of freedmen to read in secret gatherings under the stars, where the alphabet became a tool for empowerment, letters traced in the dirt with sticks by flickering lantern light. His days followed a rhythm as steady as the river's current, a routine that provided structure in a world that often seemed chaotic and hostile. Every morning, without fail, Isaiah rose before dawn, when the world was still wrapped in darkness and the first birdsong pierced the silence like a call to arms. He brewed a pot of weak coffee from grounds he stretched thin, adding chicory root foraged from the riverbank to make it last longer, and sat on his porch, a rickety platform of salvaged boards, to watch the sky lighten from black to indigo to rose, the colors reflecting off the dew-covered grass. The coffee was bitter, a far cry from the army rations he remembered, but it warmed him against the chill that seeped into his bones from old wounds, the mini ball in his hip a constant companion that throbbed with the changing weather. Then, with his forage cap pulled low to shade his eyes and his coat buttoned against the morning dew that clung to the leaves like diamonds, he walked the mile into town, his limp a constant companion, each step a deliberate effort that reminded him of the price he had paid for freedom. The road was rutted from wagon wheels, flanked by fields where cotton bolls burst white against the green, worked by sharecroppers who nodded to him in silent solidarity, their backs bent under the same sun that had scorched their ancestors. Forsyth Square came into view, the courthouse at its center, a squat brick building with white columns that spoke of antebellum grandeur now faded and chipped. Hargrove's General Store with its wide porch, barrels of flour and salt pork stacked outside, the scent of molasses wafting from within. The blacksmith's forge belching smoke and sparks, the ring of hammer on anvil a steady beat, and the church steeple rising like a finger pointing to heaven, though its preacher often sermonized on the natural order of races, quoting scripture to justify the chains that had only recently been broken. Isaiah settled on the same weathered bench outside the general store, a spot that afforded him a view of the bustling square without drawing undue attention. It was a bench no one else claimed, perhaps out of superstition or disdain for the Yankee who occupied it. But it suited him perfectly, offering a place to rest his weary leg and observe the world. There, he would unfold a discarded newspaper, often a day or two old, left behind by some merchant or traveler who had no use for yesterday's news. He read slowly, savoring the words that connected him to a world beyond Forsyth's narrow horizons. News of President Hayes in Washington, debates over the rights of freedmen in Congress, stories of lynchings in Mississippi that made his blood run cold and reminded him of the fragility of his own existence. Reports of railroads expanding west, promising opportunity but excluding men like him. Reading was a skill he had learned in the Army, taught by a white chaplain from Massachusetts named Reverend Ellis, who believed knowledge was the key to true liberty and spent evenings around campfires teaching letters to men who had been forbidden to learn under slavery. Isaiah cherished it, turning each page with care, his calloused fingers tracing the print as if to absorb the ink into his soul, the words a bridge to a larger America that he had fought to preserve. On this particular April morning, the air hummed with the usual rhythm of awakening. Roosters crowing from distant farms, their calls echoing across the fields. Wagons creaking under loads of cotton bound for market, the drivers cracking whips and cursing at mules. The distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer shaping iron into horseshoes or plowshares, and the murmur of early shoppers haggling over prices at the store, bargaining for fabric or tobacco. Isaiah arrived at his bench as the first rays pierced the horizon, gilding the square in golden light that danced off the dew. He nodded to Mrs. Hargrove as she unlocked the store's door, her apron dusted with flour from baking biscuits for the day's customers, her hair pinned back in a bun that spoke of practical efficiency. She returned the gesture with a curt acknowledgement, her eyes flickering away quickly, polite enough to avoid outright rudeness, but laced with the wariness that came from living in a town where associating too closely with black folks could invite trouble from the Klan or the Redeemers, who monitored loyalties with vigilant eyes. The newspaper he picked up from the ground, crumpled but intact, bore headlines of political turmoil in Washington. Debates over the Compromise of 1877 that had ended Reconstruction and withdrawn federal troops from the South, leaving states like Georgia to their own devices, with governors like those in the Democratic Party reclaiming power through intimidation and fraud. Isaiah read with a furrowed brow, his thick eyebrows knitting together, his mind drifting to the promises of equality that had seemed so tangible during the war, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, words on paper that meant little when the Klan rode at night, burning crosses and enforcing their own law with ropes and rifles. He thought of his own service, the battles where he had risked everything for a nation that now seemed intent on forgetting him and his kind. The peace of the morning shattered at precisely 7:15 a.m., the time etched in Isaiah's memory like a scar. For young white men rode into the square on lathered horses, their coats dusty from the road, their laughter coarse and laced with the remnants of whiskey from an all-night gathering at a Redeemer meeting in the woods, where they had drunk to the restoration of the South and plotted ways to suppress the black vote. They were sons of prominent ex-Confederate officers, born into privilege that the war had dented but not destroyed, their families owning the land and the labor that sustained the town. Clayton Whitaker, the ringleader, was 22, with his father's sharp features, a mustache that failed to hide his boyish sneer, and a reputation for cruelty honed on the backs of sharecroppers on his family's plantation, where he enjoyed wielding the whip as much as his father had. Elijah Hargrove, the store owner's nephew, was broad-shouldered and quick to anger, his hands calloused from whipping horses rather than honest work, his temper legendary in the town for fights in saloons. Thomas Kane, the sheriff's boy, carried a chip on his shoulder as heavy as the deputy badge he wore unofficially, his eyes always scanning for slights, his loyalty to his father absolute. And Samuel Dixon, the quiet one, followed the others like a shadow, his conscience pricked but silenced by loyalty and fear of being labeled a lover, his face often pale when the group's antics turned vicious. They wore the white hoods of the Klan loosely around their necks like scarves, symbols of the Redeemer meetings where they plotted to reclaim what they believed the war had stolen: land, power, and the unchallenged supremacy of their race, discussing ways to intimidate black voters and drive out Union sympathizers. Their eyes fell on Isaiah almost immediately, drawn like moths to a flame they despised, the blue cap a red rag to their Confederate blood. Clayton reined in his horse first, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt near Isaiah's feet, the brown stain spreading like a blot of malice. "Well, look here, boys," he drawled, his voice carrying across the square with the arrogance of youth and privilege. "That old S still parading around in his Yankee rags. Thinks he's some kind of hero sitting there like he owns the place. Ain't that right, old man? You think that cap makes you better than us?" The others chuckled, dismounting with the swagger of untouchable youth, their boots kicking up dust as they formed a loose circle around the bench, their horses snorting and stamping. Elijah kicked at a pebble, sending it skittering toward Isaiah's feet, nearly hitting his boot. "Bet he stole that cap off a dead white man," he said, his tone mocking, his laugh a bark. "Ain't no way a darky earned it fair. Probably ran like a rabbit when the shootin' started. Hid in the bushes while real men fought." Isaiah kept his gaze on the newspaper, his hands steady despite the rising tension in his chest, his heart beating a steady rhythm honed in battle. He had faced worse. Confederate bayonets gleaming in the sun at Fort Wagner, prison camps at Andersonville where men died of starvation and despair, their bodies piling up like cordwood, the stench of death a constant companion. These boys were nothing but echoes of a defeated cause, their bravado a mask for the insecurities of a lost generation, their fathers' ghosts whispering in their ears. But their voices grew louder, drawing stares from passers-by who pretended not to notice, their eyes averted to avoid involvement, knowing that speaking up could mean their own trouble. "Hey, boy!" Clayton bellowed, stepping closer, his breath reeking of liquor and tobacco, his face inches from Isaiah's. "You deaf or just dumb? We're talking to you. Look up when white men speak, or we'll make you." Isaiah finally looked up, his expression calm, measured, the lines around his eyes deepening with patience born of survival, his gaze steady as a rock in the river. In a voice deepened by years of command, the voice that had rallied his regiment through hellish charges, shouting orders amid the roar of cannon, the said, "Good morning, gentlemen. I'd be obliged if you'd keep your voices down a mite. Folks are trying to start their day peaceful-like. That's all. No harm in that." The request was polite, devoid of challenge or anger, a simple appeal to decency in a world that often lacked it. But to Clayton it was an affront, a black man daring to dictate terms to white men, challenging the order that had been upset by the war and that they were determined to restore. His face flushed crimson, the veins in his neck bulging like ropes under strain, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You tellin' us what to do?" he snarled, his voice rising to a shout. "An old black buck like you? I'll have you know my daddy died at Gettysburg because of trash like you, charging with those Yankee dogs, thinking you could take what's ours. You and your kind ruined everything, and now you sit here giving orders." Isaiah set the newspaper aside carefully, folding it with military precision, his movements deliberate and unhurried, showing no fear. "I ain't tellin' nobody nothin'," he replied evenly, his tone as calm as the river on a still day. "Just a skin for common courtesy. I fought for this country same as any man, bled for it on fields from Florida to South Carolina. But that don't make me your enemy now. The war's over. Time to live in peace." Elijah snorted, crossing his arms over his chest, his muscles bulging under his shirt. "Fought? You mean ran away and hid behind Yankee lines. Real men wore gray, died for their homes and their honor. You and your kind just stirred up trouble, and now you sit here like you belong, reading our papers, drinking our air." The group closed in tighter, their shadows falling over Isaiah like a storm cloud blocking the sun, their presence oppressive. Samuel hung back a step, his face pale, uneasiness flickering in his eyes like a candle in the wind. But he said nothing, his silence a complicity he would later regret in quiet moments. Clayton drew his Colt revolver from its holster, the metal glinting in the morning sun like a deadly promise, the barrel cold and unforgiving. He pressed it against Isaiah's forehead, the cold steel a stark contrast to the warm air, the click of the hammer echoing in the sudden quiet of the square like a gunshot. "On your knees," Clayton hissed, his breath hot on Isaiah's face. "Apologize for breathin' our air, for wearin' that cap, for existin'. Do it now, or I'll blow your brains out right here." The square had gone silent. The usual bustle halted as if time itself held its breath. The only sound the distant crow of a rooster and the snort of a horse. Shopkeepers peered from windows, their faces pale. A few freedmen hurried away with downcast eyes, knowing intervention could mean their own noose or whipping. Mrs. Hargrove stood frozen in her doorway, her hand clutching her apron. But she made no move, her fear of the Whitaker family too deep-rooted. Isaiah met Clayton's gaze without flinching, his dark eyes steady as the riverbed, showing no fear, only resignation and dignity. "I knelt to no man but God since I was freed at Appomattox," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of history, of chains broken and battles won. "I ain't startin' today. You pull that trigger, boy, and you'll answer for it one day. If not in this world, then the next." Clayton's finger tightened on the trigger, his knuckles white, the moment stretching taut as a bowstring, the crowd holding its breath. But before he could act, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the sheriff's office across the square, quick steps on the wooden sidewalk. Sheriff Buford Kane strode toward them, his shotgun slung over his shoulder, badge gleaming on his chest like a badge of impunity, his face red from the heat or anger. He was a burly man in his 50s, with a mustache that hid a perpetual sneer and a history of turning a blind eye to Klan activities. Activities that often benefited his family's landholdings and kept the order. His son Thomas was among the group, which sealed his bias before he even arrived at the scene, his paternal instinct overriding any sense of justice. "What's the ruckus here?" Kane demanded, his voice booming as he pushed through the gathering crowd, his eyes flicking over the scene with practiced assessment, noting the gun, the tense faces, the old black man on the bench. Clayton lowered the gun but kept his stance aggressive, his face a mask of righteous indignation, his hand shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "This old darky threatened us, Sheriff." Clayton lied smoothly, his voice pitching higher with feigned fear, his eyes wide for effect. "Came at us with wild eyes, said he'd burn the town like Sherman did Atlanta. Bragged gin about his Yankee friends who could make us disappear. We feared for our lives. That's the God's truth. He was about to attack when we defended ourselves." The others nodded vigorously, their stories aligning in a rehearsed chorus, their faces flushed. "He's dangerous, Pa," Thomas added, his voice eager, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Got that wild look in his eye, like them colored soldiers who think they're equal now. Could have killed us if we hadn't stood our ground. You know how they are, war made 'em bold." Isaiah remained seated, his hands visible on his knees, making no sudden moves, his posture straight as a soldier at attention. "Sheriff," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "That's a lie plain as day. All I did was ask him to quiet down. Never raised a hand or a voice beyond that. You know me, been comin' to this bench for years without trouble. Ask Mrs. Hargrove. She saw it all." Kane's decision was swift and predictable, his face hardening as he glanced at his son and the Whitaker boy, connections that weighed heavier than truth. He grabbed Isaiah by the collar, yanking him to his feet with a force that jarred the old man's wounded hip, sending a sharp pain shooting down his leg like a hot poker. Isaiah stumbled but caught himself, his face betraying no grimace, his dignity a shield. "Isaiah Freeman," Kane snarled, his breath hot with coffee and tobacco. "You're under arrest for assaulting these fine young men, disturbing the peace, and inciting a riot. We'll see what Judge Whitaker has to say about your polite skin. Get moving." As Kane snapped iron cuffs around Isaiah's wrists, the cuffs pinching the scarred skin from his days in chains as a slave, reopening old wounds in his mind, the crowd murmured, a mix of approval from the white onlookers who nodded in satisfaction and silent horror from the few black faces in the shadows, who knew this could be them next. Someone in the crowd kicked Isaiah's forage cap into the dirt, where it lay trampled underfoot, the blue fabric ground into the red clay. The newspaper fluttered open to that headline about back pay for colored troops, a bitter irony lost in the moment as the wind scattered the pages across the square like confetti of forgotten promises. Isaiah was marched to the jail, his head held high, dignity intact amid the jeers and spit that followed him from the crowd. "String him up!" one man shouted. "Yankee loving!" another called, their voices a chorus of hate. The jail was a dank stone building behind the courthouse, its cells small and foul, reeking of mold and unwashed bodies, the walls damp with moisture from the river. Kane shoved Isaiah into a cell, the door clanging shut with finality, the sound echoing like a gavel strike. "You'll hang by sunset if the judge has his way," the sheriff muttered through the bars, turning the key with a twist that seemed final. Isaiah sank onto the hard cot, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had bitten, the red marks a reminder of chains past and present. Alone in the dim light filtering through a barred window high on the wall, memories flooded him like the Chattahoochee in flood season, overwhelming and unrelenting. He remembered his youth on the Whitaker plantation 20 miles from Forsyth, where he was born into slavery in 1813, the year of the Creek War, though he knew little of it then. The fields had been his prison, the overseer's whip his constant threat, cracking across his back for the smallest infraction. Picking cotton too slow, looking a white man in the eye. As a boy, he had picked cotton until his fingers bled. The white bowls stained red, dreaming of freedom whispered in slave quarters under the cover of night. Stories of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey passed like forbidden gospel. The war came in 1861, a distant thunder at first, but by 1863, with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation ringing like a liberty bell across the land, Isaiah seized his chance. He fled under moonlight, crossing rivers swollen with rain and dodging patrols of Confederate Home Guard, their dogs baying in the distance. He joined the Union Army in South Carolina as a Freeman, the 107th United States Colored Troops becoming his family, black men from across the South fighting not just for the Union but for their own humanity, their uniforms a symbol of hope. The battles blurred in his mind. Olustee in Florida, where the air was thick with gunpowder and screams, the ground muddy with blood, and he took that mini ball in his hip while covering a retreat, dragging a wounded comrade to safety amid the chaos. Fort Wagner, the charge up the beach under withering fire, bodies falling like wheat before a scythe, the sand turning red as the sea lapped at the dead. And Honey Hill in 1864, the defining moment that defined his valor. The Union forces were pinned in a swamp, Confederate artillery raining death from hidden positions, the air filled with the whine of shells and the cries of the wounded. General Oliver O. Howard, then a colonel, was hit by a cannonball, his arm shattered in a spray of blood and bone. Isaiah, a sergeant by then, hoisted the officer onto his back and carried him 2 miles through mud and gunfire, sniping at pursuers with his Enfield rifle in one hand, his muscles burning, his breath ragged. He saved 147 men that day, directing evacuations under fire, his actions earning a recommendation for the Medal of Honor from Howard himself. But the war ended, papers were lost in the chaos of demobilization, and racism in the military bureaucracy ensured the honor never came. The recommendation filed away because a black man receiving the nation's highest award was deemed unpalatable by some in Washington. Howard had promised to remember, shaking Isaiah's hand with his good one. But life moved on, promotions and politics pulling him away. Post-war, Isaiah returned to Georgia, marrying a freedwoman named Eliza, a woman with kind eyes and a laugh like music, who bore him 2 sons before dying of fever in 1870, leaving him to raise them alone amid the rising tide of violence. He worked the land as a sharecropper, voted during Reconstruction when federal bayonets protected the polls, even served on a jury once, judging a white man for theft, a moment of equality that felt revolutionary. But with federal troops gone, the Klan rose, burning his first home in a night of terror, the flames lighting the sky as he fled with his boys. His sons had fled north to Chicago, sending letters when they could, their handwriting improving with each one, telling of factory jobs and city lights. Isaiah lived alone, his pension delayed, his heroism forgotten, his days filled with the quiet struggle of survival. Word of the arrest spread like wildfire through Forsyth, carried on whispers in the store, shouts in the saloons, and telegraphs to neighboring towns. By noon, a mob had gathered outside the jail, ropes in hand, torches ready for nightfall, chanting for justice with voices slurred by whiskey and hate. The oak tree in the courthouse square, infamous for its grim history of lynchings. Dozens of black men hung there since the war, bore a noose swaying in the breeze like a pendulum of death, the rope thick and new. "Hang the veteran!" they cried. "Teach him their place. He threatened good white boys, and we'll make an example." Inside his cell, Isaiah prayed, his knees on the cold floor, his hands clasped, asking God for strength and forgiveness for his enemies. He thought of Eliza, her face in the firelight, of his sons, hoping they were safe in the north, of the flag he had fought for, stars and stripes that now seemed tarnished. "If this is my time," he whispered to the empty cell, "let it be with dignity, Lord. Let me die as I lived, free." The trial was set for the next morning, a hasty affair in the county courthouse, rushed to appease the mob before they took matters into their own hands. No lawyer in town would represent Isaiah. They cited conflicts or simply fear of reprisal from the Klan, who had burned barns and whipped dissenters in the past. He would defend himself or not at all, standing alone against the system. The jury was impaneled quickly. 12 white men, landowners and merchants, 6 with known Klan ties, their faces hard and unyielding, their minds made up before the first word was spoken. Judge Harlan Whitaker presided, his gavel striking like a death knell, his robe hanging loose on his frame. He was Clayton's uncle, a former Confederate colonel who had lost a leg at Gettysburg and harbored a deep hatred for Union veterans, especially black ones, his courtroom a theater for white grievance, his rulings as biased as his bloodline, often sentencing black men for minor offenses with maximum punishment. The proceedings began at 9 a.m. sharp. The courtroom was packed, the air stifling with sweat and anticipation, benches filled with townsfolk eager for a spectacle, their faces flushed with excitement or hate. Isaiah was led in chains, his limp more pronounced from a night on the cold floor, the iron rattling with each step, the sound a reminder of his captivity. He stood before the bench, meeting the judge's glare with steady eyes, his forage cap confiscated, his head bare, gray hair cropped close. "Isaiah Freeman," Judge Whitaker intoned, his voice dripping with contempt, his gavel hovering. "You stand accused of assault, disturbance of the peace, and threats against white citizens. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Isaiah replied, his voice firm, echoing in the room. "I threatened no one. I only asked for quiet." The prosecution called its witnesses, the state attorney a slick man from Atlanta with a reputation for securing convictions against black defendants. Clayton took the stand first, sworn in with a hand on the Bible, his voice trembling with feigned fear as he recounted the fabricated tale, tears welling for effect. "This man came at us like a mad dog, Your Honor. Said he'd call on his Yankee killers to wipe us out, burn our homes like Sherman did. We feared for our lives. That's the God's truth." Elijah and Thomas echoed the lies, embellishing with details of Isaiah's wild threats and savage glare. Their testimonies rehearsed in the night, inconsistencies ironed out. Samuel Dixon hesitated, his voice faltering, sweat beading on his forehead, but under pressure from his friend's stares and the judge's prompting, he followed suit, his words mumbled but damning. No cross-examination pierced the facade. Isaiah's questions, "Did I ever stand up from that bench? Did I raise a hand?" were overruled as impertinent or leading, the judge banging his gavel with glee. When it was Isaiah's turn to speak, he stood tall despite the chains, his voice carrying the authority of a sergeant addressing his troops. "Your Honor, gentlemen of the jury," he began, his eyes sweeping the room. "I served in the Union Army for 3 years, fought at Olustee, Honey Hill, Fort Wagner. I carried General Oliver Howard himself off the field when he lost his arm to a cannonball. Risked my life for the Union, for freedom. I ain't never harmed a soul in peacetime. These boys were drunk from their meetin', loud and rowdy, and took offense to a polite request. That's the truth of it, as God is my witness." The jury deliberated for 10 minutes, their verdict a foregone conclusion, the room buzzing with anticipation. Guilty on all counts. Sentence: death by hanging at sunset. The judge's words met with cheers from the crowd. As the verdict rang out, the crowd cheered, their bloodlust sated, hats thrown in the air. Isaiah was led back to his cell, the chains heavier now, the weight of injustice pressing on his shoulders like the yoke of slavery. He prayed again, preparing for the end, his mind filled with memories of battles won and freedoms unfinished, wondering if his sacrifice had been in vain. But unknown to all in Forsyth, a telegram had arrived in Washington the night before, sent by a sympathetic telegraph operator, a former Union soldier who had overheard the arrest and recognized Isaiah's name from war stories told around campfires. It reached the desk of Major General Oliver O. Howard, now head of the Freedmen's Bureau, a one-armed veteran whose life had been saved by Isaiah 33 years prior at Honey Hill, the memory as fresh as the pain in his stump on rainy days. General Howard read the message with a surge of guilt and resolve, his good hand clenching the paper, his face paling. He had promised to honor Isaiah's heroism, but the chaos of war's end, combined with institutional prejudice against awarding high honors to black soldiers, had buried the Medal of Honor recommendation in red tape, the paperwork lost or ignored. Howard had risen in rank, founded Howard University to educate freedmen, advocated for their rights in Congress, but the debt to Isaiah haunted him like a ghost, waking him at night with dreams of the swamp and the gunfire. Now, with federal influence waning but his personal authority intact, he acted decisively. He wired President Rutherford B. Hayes for a pardon, citing Isaiah's service and the injustice, and gathered an escort of 20 U.S. colored troops, veterans like Isaiah, men from the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, their uniforms crisp, rifles at the ready, their faces determined. They boarded a train south, the rails humming with urgency, the cars rocking as they sped through the night, switching to horseback for the final leg through Georgia's backroads, avoiding ambushes from redeemers who might intercept them, the group riding hard, dust in their wake. The journey was arduous. Dust-choked roads that choked the horses, suspicious townsfolk who stared from porches, the constant threat of violence from Klan scouts who patrolled the countryside. Howard rode at the front, his sling a reminder of Honey Hill, his mind replaying the day Isaiah carried him through the swamp, bullets whizzing past, the sergeant's strength unyielding, his voice calm amid the chaos. "We owe him this," he told his men during a brief rest, their campfires low to avoid detection. "America owes him more than we can pay." Back in Forsyth, the mob grew as sunset approached, torches lit against the deepening twilight, their faces twisted in hate, the air thick with the smell of pitch and sweat. Isaiah was marched to the oak tree, the noose waiting, rough hands pushing him onto the platform, the wood creaking under his weight. The rope was looped around his neck, coarse hemp scratching his skin, the knot tight. Judge Whitaker read the sentence, his voice triumphant, the crowd roaring approval, their voices a cacophony of hate. But as the executioner stepped forward, his hand on the lever, hoofbeats thundered into the square like the cavalry charge of old, the ground vibrating. General Howard and his men rode in, rifles raised, forming a protective line around the platform, their uniforms a splash of blue in the orange light. The mob faltered, confusion rippling through their ranks, murmurs turning to gasps as they recognized the general's insignia. "Stop this execution," Howard commanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a saber, his horse rearing. The sheriff hesitated, his shotgun lowering, the crowd murmuring in awe and fear at the sight of federal uniforms, the bayonets glinting. Howard dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt, and strode to the platform, his escort covering him with rifles aimed at the mob. He approached Isaiah, removing his hat with reverence, his face etched with emotion. To the shock of all, he dropped to one knee and bowed his head, the general humbling himself before the veteran, the crowd gasping as one. "Sergeant Freeman," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, tears in his eyes. "You saved my life and 147 others at Honey Hill, carried me through hell itself. I bow to you now as America should have long ago. Forgive the delay in honoring you." He rose, turning to the stunned judge, and laid the presidential pardon and the long-lost Medal of Honor citation on the platform, the papers fluttering slightly in the breeze. "This man is a hero. Harm him, and you answer to the United States Army and the President himself." The chains fell from Isaiah's wrists, the noose removed by trembling hands. The mob dispersed in confusion and fear, Their ropes abandoned, their torches dropped. Clayton and his friends were arrested on the spot for perjury and attempted murder. Their families shamed as federal troops escorted them to jail. Their cries of protest drowned out. Sheriff Kane fled town that night, his badge left behind in the dust. He was found 3 states away, trying to start anew, but justice caught up, a federal warrant leading to his arrest. Isaiah Freeman walked free, the Medal of Honor pinned to his chest by the general's own hand, the metal cold against his skin. The town watched in silence as he returned to his shack, but the story spread across Georgia and beyond, inspiring freedmen to stand tall, newspapers printing the tale as a symbol of justice. General Howard ensured his pension was paid in full, with back pay that allowed him to build a small school. Isaiah lived out his days teaching history to the next generation. His sons returning to help, his legacy a beacon. He passed in 1895 at 82, buried with full military honors under that same oak tree, now a monument to Union veterans, his grave marked by the medal he had earned through blood, sweat, and unbreakable spirit. The arc of justice, though bent and slow, had finally bowed to truth.